So yes, Révah is of the most influential historians of the Sephardim. During the brief period in the 1950s and 1960s, in which this French Hispanist published his article and books, he covered an impressive range of fields: Judeo-Spanish linguistics, the history of the New Christians under the Inquisition, the institutional history of the Holy Office in Portugal, Portuguese attitudes towards Judaism in general, the diaspora of the Portuguese Jews, but also, perhaps most famously, the Jewish origins of secular modernity, thanks to his research into the Jewish background of Spinoza and his circle. My admiration for Révah's work began more than 50 years ago, when I was a student at the Hebrew University with Professor Joseph Kaplan. As I was preparing a paper on Uriel da Costa, Professor Kaplan directed me to Révah's article because he said I was in the favorable situation of knowing to read French. Yes, Révah, as I read him and as I read him many times afterwards, succeeded in connecting Uriel da Costa, the Jewish freethinker of Amsterdam, who committed suicide in 1640, to his youth as in a new Christian neighborhood of Porto in Portugal. He described the new Christians' public life in trade, in church, and their secret life as crypto-Jews, as marranos at home. And what fascinated me from the first moment was the documented and detailed fashion by which Révah could evoke this historical environment. He knew in which house in the Rua de São Miguel, the street of the new Christians, lived pious Catholics whose daughters were nuns and whose sons were Jesuits, and in which other house people kept Jewish traditions and would end up in Amsterdam or had already cousins in Florence or elsewhere. Where there were people who tried to stay and make peace with Portuguese Catholic society after generations of tribulations and of persecutions. And where exactly would live Uriel da Costa, who was during his life a Catholic, a Marrano, a Jew, a scripturalist, and finally a naturalist deist, the free thinkers. And those people were all living in the street together and interacted with each other, and all this is described by Révah. Révah's research is border crossing in many ways. First, he is one of the few historians of Sephardic Jewry who researched both the Eastern and the Western Sephardic sources in their original, and who also was an expert on Christian church history. So he had a very high level of intercultural competence. Second, he was a scholar for whom there was no distinction between literary and social history. He was, in fact, he had a chair of Hispanic studies, but he could move freely from the texts to the contexts and come to explanations on the basis of a more dense and organic picture than the approaches that isolate one of the two disciplines, Hispanic studies or social history, respectively. And third, his procedure was always to search interpretations that fitted his documentary evidence rather than select evidence that fits theoretical constructions and throw away all the rest of the documentation. And fourth, his descriptions were complex. They fully recognize that individuals are diverse, that they are dynamic, that they change, and that they even are often double, that they hesitate between contradictory models of identity. A population initially quite homogeneous of Judeo converts would thus split up during the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries into many paths. Some descendants became Jesuits, others Jews, others freethinkers. He had no problem in envisioning radical changes of attitude and self-identity, even in the course of one person's life. Yet his work is much better known, as you have said already, among erudite scholars than among the larger audience. Révah wrote a great number of journal articles rather than a handy synthesis, as his competitors like Antonio José Saraiva did. And in his research, he reconstructed multiple historical lines of transmission rather than proffering monocausal explanations and speaking about clear structural forces. So if you look for generalizing narratives, E.S. Révah has very little to offer. If you want theories about exclusion and inclusion, otherness and identity, habitus and the social construction of difference, etc., and other such concepts that have come to dominate historiography during the past half century. Révah has therefore been often named a positivist insofar as he demanded clear documentary evidence for any historical judgment. And the Portuguese literary historian Antonio José Saraiva, who had read New Christian history in the Marxist key, was thus in an irreconcilable disagreement with Révah, which burst out in a famous polemic during the summer of 1971, to which I will come back. So though Révah's research and polemic was more familiar to me than that of any other historian of the Conversos, his personality was some kind of a mystery. I knew that he was French and that he was Jewish, but his personality remained hidden behind his own effort of objective documentation that motivates his work. And for a long time, I even looked in vain for his first names, since he only uses his initials, and I could not find his place of birth anywhere. I remember him as a haughty, dogmatic polemicist from his reaction to Saraiva, and I was very surprised when I first came across his portrait that took a long time, which showed a man with a round and calm physiognomy expressing a friendly interest in the unknown author that he was reading, perhaps a paper of a student. It was a moving experience to meet his widow and to make friends with his sons, to retrieve his personal papers and to work on them. And in my lecture, I will therefore start with the first chapter about Révah's life. Then I will comment on his research on the New Christians. And in the third step, I will present how he endeavored to defend it in highly polemical settings. So the Révah are an old family of Salonika, who are attested there all the way back to the arrival of the Jews from Spain in tomb inscriptions and a number of other sources. According to the Révah family's tradition, their ancestors were boatsmen in the harbor who unloaded merchandise and passengers. Albert Révah, E.S. Révah's father, was an accountant, a bookkeeper. He and his wife emigrated during the First World War, shortly before the devastating fire of 1917, and found their first refuge, of all places, in Berlin, in Germany. And it was there that their son was born on the 16th of April. His parents named him Israel Salvator after his grandfather. They did not know what a burden they would put on him of being called Israel during the 20th century. The family moved to Paris in 1920 with the support of the Alliance Israélite Universelle. They settled in the 11th district, then the neighborhood that received thousands of Ottoman Jews and was a kind of small Sephardic quarter. Révah lost his father when he was 8 years old, and he grew up with his mother, who kept a store where she sewed and sold bonnets. This woman, Estrella, allegedly did not know to read and to write That's what that's what her grandsons report. But she picked up foreign languages very easily, whether German or French. And her native Judeo-Spanish must have been a spring well of proverbs and sayings, which E.S. Révah sometimes wrote down with the philological schooling that he had received. At the time, the French government launched a program that offered free high school admission to exceptionally talented immigrants. And young Révah was ambitious enough to dare and win this competition, and the orphan from the immigrant neighborhood could just thus earn his high school diploma at the Lycée Louis le Grand, one of the best schools in Paris. He later had the modesty to mention Romain Thomas, his teacher of Spanish at school, who had been amazed at this native Spanish speaker, a native Spanish speaker who had no contact with Spain for 400 years, and who had a very peculiar approach to the Spanish language and literature. And Révah turned his unique linguistic background into a vocation for Hispanic philology. He studied Spanish philology at the Sorbonne for 2 years, and in 1937 he completed the national teachers exam, the agrégation, as the first ranked graduate all over France. With his diploma, he could easily have obtained a state appointment at a college as a college teacher, but he refused. He was attracted to academic research, and he wanted to make a career at university as a Jewish immigrant. In 1937, when the young Révah decided to become a Hispanist, his discipline was going through a crucial moment. So I just skipped one image, but I want to give it to you again because it's so impressive. It is a Sephardic cafe in his neighborhood. And being a Hispanist in 1937 was a moment, happened at a moment in which Spain was torn apart by the Civil War. Hispanists, of course, could not go to Spain to study and to work. And the World Fair that took place in Paris in the same year showed Picasso's Guernica, which you all know, in front of the overpowering pavilions of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. You see that there on the image. Nations ceased to be unified historical actors in Iberian historiography under this impression of the Civil War. In that very year, 37, Marcel Bataillon published his path-breaking book, Erasmus and Spain, Erasme y l'Espagne. The Spanish followers of Erasmus formed a powerful cultural movement in the 16th century, Bataillon showed. They were partisans of an ironic modernism that was open to all kinds of European and extra-European innovations and discovery. It was a movement that would finally be repressed by the Church and by the Inquisition, by the Counter-Reformation, and would go underground, but have all kinds of repercussions all through the early modern period in Spain and Portugal. And Bataillon wrote a literary, an intellectual, a religious and social history of this Spanish Erasmian movement that set new scholarly standards, and Révah was fascinated by this, as many other readers, for whom it supplied a historical genealogy of another kind of Spain, not a Spain of the Inquisition and of the bullfights and of the Holy Virgin only. And Révah, as he remembered, was thrilled by Bataillon's observation that not a few among the dissidents of the Spanish Renaissance were descendants of converted Jews. So Révah obtained the scholarship from the University of Paris, which allowed him to study 2 more years at a postgraduate institution, the École pratique des hautes études, where he took classes in linguistics, and also in Christian religious history with Jean Baruzzi. He learned Hebrew with Isidore Lévy, a professor of classical philology. And a scholarship allowed him to travel to Salonika and Istanbul in the summer of 1938, where he carried out linguistic research. And in early 1939, he went on a mission to Portugal and to London. You see, he could not travel to Spain, of course, because of the Civil War. So Portugal became a new center of interest for him. He learned Portuguese at this time, and he eventually would become a Lusitanist, mainly working on Portuguese sources. Georges Sirot, his academic supervisor, was delighted with his progress and wrote an enthusiastic report that appeared in the Bulletin Hispanique, in the main Hispanistic journal of France at the time. And I have an extract here from a report that Révah himself wrote about his travels to the Balkan. He wrote there that he had compiled more than 1,000 Judeo-Spanish proverbs during his stay in Salonika, speaking with everyone in Judeo-Spanish and collecting this popular wisdom. He had started publishing also articles. He was barely 20 or 21 when he started his publishing career, and he had over-accomplished the high expectations that everybody had set in him. And Sirot summarizes this very nicely, in which he says that there's no reason to justify anymore that it was an excellent idea of the University of Paris to spend this scholarship in Hispanic studies, and that Révah had set out exploring the old Spain, La vieille Espagne des Sephardim, the old Spain of the Sephardim out there in the Balkans, that he was about to expand the boundaries of the field of religious studies, élargissant le domaine des études hispaniques. And he also congratulated Révah for, meanwhile, having founded a suburban home in Créteil near Paris with his wife Claire, and the couple would have 4 sons. So this was an enormous triumph at a very young age in the Hispanic world of Paris, putting Judeo-Spanish on the map of Hispanic studies in the 1930s in France. Révah had just made a promising start as a researcher when his career was interrupted by the war and by the anti-Jewish policies of the occupation regime. Since he had been naturalized as a French citizen, Révah was drafted to the French army in 1939 when the war started, and he was then demobilized after the French defeat of 1940. He did not return to the German occupation zone, and the racist laws of the Vichy regime excluded him from university. He realized very soon that his life was in danger, and he went into hiding with his family in the countryside from 1940 in a village called Mézières-en-Brenne. You see it there on the map. It is far away from everything, but not from a camp of deportation, where Révah was interned for a moment, where the selection took place of those Jews who were to be deported to the camps in the east, and those who still had some utility for civil society. And it seems that Marcel Bataillon intervened at this moment by proving that he was still needed to accomplish his academic work with a scholarship that he had received before the racial laws. And indeed, Révah would later thank Bataillon for his support in these very dark moments, which helped him escape labor service and probably deportation. From 1943, Révah was a teacher at the OSE, the Œuvre de Secours aux Enfants, the clandestine Jewish charity at the orphanage that had been installed in the castle of Chabannes near Saint-Pierre-de-Fursac in the same southwest French region. After the liberation, Révah found an employment as a high school teacher in Bordeaux, but he found all university positions filled. The survivor resented the cool reception by the Hispanists who had mostly collaborated with the fascist regime. Later on, he wrote to Bataillon in retrospect, I quote, "People were surprised to see me return in 1944. And after he competed for a number of university positions and he was always rejected, he concluded, as he wrote to Bataillon, "My desire was to return to nothingness so that I would not have to compete with anyone in the world." Still, he was unwilling to retreat into secondary teaching. He wanted to continue research. And at that moment, in 1946, he accepted a research scholarship in Lisbon and went to live there with his family for almost a decade until 1955. He decided to do excellent work, even in the absence of an institutional recognition. While he was teaching at the French Institute there in Lisbon, he could make himself a name with publications of various authors of the Portuguese Renaissance, such as Gil Vicente and João de Barros. He also supplied yearly reviewed for the scholarly bibliography in Portuguese studies of the Bulletin Hispanique, which brought him fame and respect. So he was publishing enormously during the late 40s and early 50s, as you see in these few examples. And he has an interesting correspondence with Bataillon during those times between Lisbon and Paris. And in 1949, he wrote in a very disillusioned way that he had good companions in Lisbon, Eugenio Asensio, who was a Spaniard having taken refuge in Lisbon, and Damien Sonal, a Frenchman, who were facing similar distress. And this circle had learned, Révah writes, to stay on the outside, to avoid elitist circles, and to believe in the virtue of friendship. His voluntary exile ended in 1955 when Révah was called to the Hispanic chair at the 4th section of the École pratique des hautes études in Paris. Révah taught medieval and Renaissance topics there, as well as linguistics, and he brought in his Jewish interests very, very sparingly and cautiously at the beginning. From his first year, he studied medieval Spanish Bible versions, and in 1958, he began a 2-year lecture that compared the evolution of the Spanish language in Latin America with that among the Jews in the Mediterranean. So Judeo-Spanish studies are back, but in a very low key and on a low profile. But from 1960, the historian Fernand Braudel, known for his history of the Mediterranean, invited him to teach at the 6th section of the École pratique des hautes études, the section of social studies, and Révah delivered there an introduction to the study of the new Christian merchant colonies. He continued giving classes on all kinds of Hispanistic subjects, especially Brazilian dialectology, until 1966, but he would progressively concentrate his teaching on the Jewish topics that interested him in his research, especially the Portuguese New Christians. Révah arrived at the peak of his career when in 1966 he became Marcel Bataillon's successor at the Collège de France, the most prestigious academic institution in France. He could serve at his chair only 5 years when he had to interrupt his classes due to illness. It is remarkable that the teaching during this time was entirely devoted to Jewish topics, so that Révah turned his position at the Collège de France from the beginning to a chair in Sephardic studies. Around 1968, his enormous output of publications quite suddenly dwindled. His medical condition was probably not the only reason. As his personal archives show, he invested much work in research for class manuscripts and long-term book projects that remained unedited. His teaching also encountered pressure from outside, since he openly criticized the views that two prominent Iberian authors, Americo Castro and the already mentioned Antonio José Saraiva, had expressed among the conversos. Castro treated the conversos as a social caste and blamed them of the establishment of the Inquisition. Saraiva saw the conversos as a class, an early modern bourgeoisie, but not as an ethnic or as a religious group. Against both authors, Révah defended the Jewish ethno-religious dimension of New Christian identity. After his polemic in summer 1971 with Saraiva, Révah was forced to interrupt his classes in December that year to submit to a protracted cancer treatment. He passed away in 1973 at the age of only 55. Though his classes at the college were rarely followed by more than 10 students, Révah had an important circle of disciples who edited various commemorative publications, some of them immediately after his demise in the Revue des Études Juives. This is the polemic with Saraiva, by the way. Others, 2 volumes with reprint of his articles, appeared later under the title Études Portugaises and De Marans à Spinoza. The first in the 1970s, I think 1975, and the second 20 years later in 1995. A memory volume, Memorial Yes Révah, appeared in 2001, which also kicked off the posthumous edition of Révah's unpublished texts. I have published 2 series of his lectures, one from the École Pratique and one from the Collège de France, one about a Spanish topic and the other on a Portuguese one. And Sara Jimenez, a scholar of Judeo-Spanish, has recently revived his collection of proverbs. These proverbs are a precious and very moving document, which brings us back to the year 1938, when a young linguist captured the wisdom and humor of the Spanish Jews, who would be deported and murdered just 5 years later by the German Nazis. It is a group portrait of a vanished world, not unlike the photos that Roman Wiśniak took in Poland on the eve of the Holocaust. Révah's work in Judeo-Spanish linguistics would certainly deserve more attention, but I will focus here on the research that the author realized on the conversos of Spain and Portugal, as well as their diaspora during the 16th and the 17th century. As I mentioned, Bataillon's book of 1937 had convinced his young reader that there existed another Spain, an intellectual world open to the European horizons of the Renaissance, the Reformation, and scientific modernity. A kind of Spain that was largely shaped by remnants from the Jewish Middle Ages, but at the same time imbued with early modern culture and engaged with the contemporary currents of Judaism. During his research in Portugal, Révah had concentrated on literary and intellectual history, as you have seen, until he came across documents of a campaign for political reform that the Portuguese Jesuits initiated in the mid-17th century against the Inquisition. And he documented this campaign in one important study. In 1955, he also published his first study on a converso community. Several families of Portuguese New Christians had gathered in Rouen. in the early 17th century, but the Portuguese Inquisition persecuted them after they had returned to Portugal, and Révah wrote a history of this exilic community in France, which he dedicated to his teacher Isidore Lévy in his Jubilee volume. Révah discovered at this moment the importance of the espionage networks that the Iberian Inquisitions maintained outside their countries and that they collected on huge volumes in their archives. The experience in the Portuguese archives with these kinds of espionage volumes served Révah well when he obtained the possibility to visit Spain for the first time in 1955 and to consult Inquisition documents in the National Archives. He succeeded in finding more documents about the crypto-Jewish circles that lived among the Portuguese of Rouen, and he also found a vast documentation on the well-known poet Antonio Enriquez Gomez, who was part of these circles in the Inquisition archives and who then clandestinely returned to Spain, even though he was searched and persecuted by the Inquisition under a false name. So he describes this as almost a detective novel, and recreated his history and the history of his family in a fascinating detail with the help of the Spanish archives. Peak of these discoveries, he found 2 testimonies of Inquisition spies from Amsterdam who had met Spinoza, the future philosopher, and his friend Juan de Prado when they were still living within a circle of Jewish free thinkers. So these are the discoveries that mainly made E.S. Révah famous when he published them in 1958. Starting with these discoveries, which he enthusiastically reported to Bataillon in his correspondence, Révah turned to the social and religious history of the crypto-Judaic movement among the conversos. He recognized that this religious conviction, which he called the marranisme, the religion of crypto-Judaism, but a religion in itself, was a cultural tradition that was transmitted most frequently within the family context and similar social patterns, especially among friends and within the merchant colonies formed by the Hebrew nation, the descendants of the converted Jews in Portugal or abroad. He chose to research these long-term transmission lines and treated them as a context of a literary author and his oeuvre who emerged from these networks. And in summer 1961, Révah found the material for an ideal case study balancing social and intellectual history according to this original model. When he started working on the New Christian merchants of Porto, he found ample information on the family of Uriel da Costa. This discovery became the basis of his lectures at the Collège de France, which I have edited from a manuscript of about 1,200 pages, going into the life of the New Christian neighborhood of Porto in all the details. During the following year, Révah approached the history of Spinoza's maternal ancestors, who were likewise from Porto, as well as the story of João Pinto Delgado, who hailed from the Algarve and reached Amsterdam via Rouen. In 1965, Révah presented findings from the Spanish archives on further writers who had passed from Christianity to Judaism, among them the royal chronicler Rodrigo Mendes Silva and Baltadar Álvarez de Orobio, also known as Isaac Orobio de Castro. In his later years, Révah devoted much unpublished research to Elijah Montalto, the famous Portuguese Jewish doctor, and to Fernão Álvares Melo, also known as David Abenatar Melo, poet, whom he researched during his last visit to the Portuguese National Archives in 1971. Révah repeatedly justified his method of combining intellectual and social history. In his unpublished lectures of 1969-1970, these are lectures that I am preparing for publication still, Révah claimed that in this way, we obtain an accurate picture of the real history of peninsular New Christianity. This history, he writes, is extraordinarily complicated and does not lend itself to theories of peremptory unilateralism. That was meant against Révah and his theory. He explained further, there is no need for lengthy argument to prove that historians arrive at more sound conclusions when, instead of trying to gauge the fairness of a single inquisitorial sentence or the authenticity of a single denunciation, statement, or accusation, they reconstruct the history of an entire neo-Christian family. The fact is that if the historian adopts this method, he very often has much more information at his disposal than was available to the inquisitors at the precise moment when they handed down a particular sentence. Those who have followed our research, he continues, particularly over the last 8 years, he writes in 1969, know that although their initial justification is almost always the biography and work of a writer, in fact, they almost always fit into a family context. So we see here the slip from a literary biography and the model of a literary biography to a form of social history that covers several generations of crypto-Judaic transmission. So this approach of the New Christian phenomenon involves treating it as a complex, multi-causal and multi-layered phenomenon of infinite variation. And in one summary, Révah states that he always endeavored to show that the history of this initially homogeneous ethnic grouping, namely the Judeo-converts, is, I quote, of a great complexity resulting from the interaction of 4 different factors through several centuries of history, with highly variable results for each individual destiny, namely, first, the sincerity of adherence to a religious faith, Catholic or crypto-Jewish. Second, the reaction to the effects of the inquisitorial repression of crypto-Judaism. And third, the strength of the attachment to the native soil, Spain or Portugal. And finally, fourth, the economic and social constraints. Individual New Christians experience the contrasting influences of each of these 4 factors. Religious attitudes differed within the family. The economic prospects of the Portuguese expansion competed with those of the diaspora. The persecution trauma could bring about assimilation, but also flight, as well as political or clandestine self-organization. All these external factors can have very different and ambivalent effects. In the lecture class that Révah gave at the Collège de France on December 4th, 1971, he expressed his conviction that the historian dealing with the religious diversity among the New Christians should push differentiation to the utmost limits. To put it radically, one must consider as unique the case of each of these hundreds of thousands of people, often tossed between the official Catholicism of their homeland and the Judaism practiced by their ancestors, without forgetting Protestantism or free thought, where some among them searched for the solution to their religious problem. So he is very much against any sort of structural determinism, but reconstructed the cultural profile of the converso community in Portugal and Spain as very, very diverse, influenced by a number of different factors, among them the Jewish diaspora, but the return to Judaism of so many of them proves that some kind of a cultural preparation and an emotional readiness must have prepared this return, and this hidden ethnicity made the new Christian, and this is the famous definition of Révah, into potential Jews. So this transmission of ethnic memory did not always express itself in crypto-Jewish beliefs or practices, but in a certain consciousness and awareness of ethnic origins. The reconstruction of the infinite accidents of family transmissions demanded an extremely precise, we would say, micro-historical method. During his the period in which he worked in this direction between 1955 and 1975, Révah stayed almost every summer with his family in Portugal and plowed through an enormous material at the National Archives, which at the time were a very small institution of no more than 20 desks in the monastery, the former monastery of the Benedictines in Lisbon. Révah had obtained the permission even to work in the stacks without having to order the volumes to his desk, and he claimed to have read more than 1,000 trial records, besides the accusation registers and the correspondence. He used to compile summaries of trial records according to fixed criteria, used the contemporary indexes of names to get an exhaustive harvest of the material, and he visualized the relations between dozens of family members in genealogical charts that often covered 4 or 5 generations, from the first generation of converts to the return of their descendants to Judaism. Révah had more than 1,000 pages of the most important documents transcribed by professional typists or copied by his own hand, and he did some part of the interpretation and discussion in his unpublished lecture manuscripts. I mentioned this because there are perhaps some genealogists among you who might be interested in these more technical details. Révah's personal archives, very vast personal archives, contain all these documents and summaries, and a single of these many folders might provide enough material for a doctoral thesis and for academic glory. Finally, in the decision by the family and his descendants, it was decided to give all this treasure to the library of the Alliance Israélite Universelle, where it can now be consulted under the shelf mark AP, the Archive Privé number 39. And I now come to my last chapter, the polemics. You will have noticed that Révah's research method, based on converso genealogy, multi-religious family history, and the literary expression of Jewish descendants, is a necessary condition for his postulate of a Jewish continuity from the Sephardic Middle Ages to Jewish Amsterdam, including the circles of disbelief and free thought. This idea was more provocative and controversial as it may seem. The immediate issue of discord between Révah and his Portuguese colleague António José Saraiva was the existence of crypto-Judaism, and in consequence the value of its major proof, which are the archives of the Holy Office. Both antagonists, however, endeavored to stage a philosophical disagreement on the very character of historical scholarship. Their respective self-fashionings were in line with the dichotomy of structural and historicist approaches to the past. For Révah, Saraiva's book, Inquisition and New Christians, which had an enormous success in 1969, was a demagogical lampoon, he wrote, a mere essay manufactured by a pseudo-historian who has never consulted a single trial from the Iberian Inquisition archives. For Révah, in turn, Révah was a genealogist to whom, I quote, "the 1,000 trials that he collected have not inspired a single idea." For the sake of controversy, both historians conveniently exaggerated the rift between document-based and idea-based scholarship, and so did their students. In his recent book, Strangers Within, Francisco Betancourt regularly uses the adjective positivist when he speaks of Révah, accusing him of believing uncritically in any written source that he finds in the archives. In Betancourt's view, the Inquisition sources on the converso's religion do not deserve more trust than the documents from the contemporary witch trials, where the witches hover through the air. Révah, however, does not actually conform to these stereotypes of the positivist. In his inaugural lesson at the Collège de France, he claimed to have learned from Marcel Bataillon an approach that stood constantly on the solid ground of texts and documents, but this did not mean that the sources spoke for themselves and that the subjective interpretation of the historian could be precluded. He writes there, "Since reading a certain introduction to the philosophy of history by Raymond Aron, Mr. Bataillon no longer believes that history can be strictly objective. Far be it from me to deny the importance for the historian of the present from which he sees the past. But I am also convinced of the possibility of effecting, up to a certain point, the bracketing, la mise en parenthèse of a given historical fact." So this is a mitigated belief in historical objectivity. It is thus not entirely certain that Pierre Chonu, a colleague and friend of Révah, had understood Révah well when he attributed to him the aphorism, "The Inquisition is never wrong. L'Inquisition ne se trompe jamais." At the beginning of his unpublished methodological lectures, Révah intended to explain his principles of an unbiased, non-ideological, document-based, yet at the same time self-critical scholarship. Saraiva had argued that any approach by a historian is shaped by the ideologies of his time, to which Révah replied that he did not share the ideology of any of the early modern authors. His own case as a Jew, a secular Jew, who took the Inquisition document seriously, was proof that even a strong emotional bias can be detected and overcome. He expresses himself in quite a careful way. "My ethnic origins," he writes, "as well as that which one must call my ideology," he goes no further than that, "place me perhaps automatically within the human camp of firm opponents to the inquisitorial institution." Yet Révah strongly advocated in favor of an even-handed and carefully contextualized representation. And he concluded, "Not every thesis that makes the inquisitors appear more odious is ipso facto historiographically more accurate." Révah alludes to his Jewish standpoint only very cautiously. His critics, however, referred to his Jewishness much more explicitly when it came to discuss or dismiss his positions. The Sevillian Hispanist Juan Guillermo García Valdecasas even insinuated that Révah was somewhat cynical, since he sided with the abhorred tribunal with the Inquisition when there was no other way to prove the existence of Iberian crypto-Judaism. And then García Valdecasas writes, "What a curious trust in the Inquisition can one find among those who most detest it any time than that this serves their interests." These expressions of anti-Jewish prejudice show Révah's pioneering position in an academic environment of the 1960s that was much less welcoming, surprisingly, to Jewish themes and approaches than was Marcel Bataillon or had been Georges Sirot in the interwar period. Révah's historicism, his insistence on ethno-religious forces, and especially on a continuous Jewish transmission in the early modern period, were isolated and provocative at the time. They isolated him among the French Annales school, which was basically structuralist. Révah also had difficult relations with the Iberian left, who painted him as a Jewish fanatic, so that both sides clashed with their ambitions to appropriate the new Christians either for a Portuguese or for a Jewish narrative. The vast body of texts that the Révah controversy has produced and continues producing until this day encouraged, this reflects the vicissitudes and ultimate failure of an alliance between Jewish scholarship and a form of leftist structuralism during the third quarter of the 20th century. What divided Révah and Saraiva was not only the politics of belonging, but also a philosophical question of whether historians should search for objectivized structures or follow the concatenation of events beyond the point at which this concatenation eludes any rational order. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. That was absolutely fascinating. Could I ask you to close your PowerPoint, please?
Yes.
Excellent. I'll just make a couple of brief comments, and I'm sure Ton and others have much more interesting things to say. The first thing that occurs to me is that in our particular area, in terms of genealogy, France is very far ahead in terms of Sephardic genealogy, and I think perhaps in the Anglosphere we suffer by our appalling inability to learn foreign languages. So academics like Révah and Gérard Nahon and others are sort of not exactly lost to us, but kind of in the distance. And the second observation is that he really has stood the test of time. I mean, I think most of us here would very strongly support the approach that he's taken, and other very fashionable historians of their time. I suppose Cecil Roth in England is the classic example. Are still remembered, but not really as relevant as Révah is. So very very interesting, and hopefully the archives in the Alliance library will be digitized as quickly as possible, and maybe we can have our friends at the Cercle de Généalogie Juif in Paris sort of try and encourage and support them. But
That
thank
would
you.
be
That was a
great.
very, very, very interesting presentation. Thank you. Ton, over to you.
Yeah. I was fascinated by this slide that mentioned all these crypto-Jewish New Christian writers. And I noticed that there are books about Uriel da Costa, about Fernão Alvarez Melo, about Orobio de Castro, and about Antonio Enriquez Gomez. Will the rest be published too in the future on the basis of Révah's work?
Excuse me?
Will there be monographs about Rodrigo Mendes Silva, about João Pinto Delgado, like the one you did about Uriel da Costa?
So Rodrigo Mendes Silva, fortunately, Révah published himself an article in which he summarized his findings in the Bulletin Hispanique. And his findings on Uriel da Costa also produced an article in the Beidragen and Mededelingen in a Dutch journal, which do not have all the documents and all the references. But meanwhile, all these documents have been magnificently presented by Josef Kaplan, so that their interest is rather for the history of research, and there are certain details that can still be found and that Révah knew that are not in the book, so that our focus in editing texts from Révah's work is now on the Judeo-Spanish side. There are big, long lectures that he gave at the Collège de France, history of the Judeo-Spanish language and other such important work, lexicographical work and others that are in the process of being published. And there is his last lecture at the École Pratique, which is his defense against Antonio José Saraiva, which he used for a methodological treatise, in which he tried to show by which different methods a critical historian can discern whether an inquisitorial document should be taken at face value or whether it should be criticized or rejected. And this is a very long text, that a lecture that he gave over the last years of his teaching, several times interrupted by his illness, that we are still preparing for publication.
Yeah. The book that you edited about Uriel da Costa is alas sold out. Are you considering a reprint or maybe even a translation in English?
Oh, this was very unfortunate, by the way, because the editor, the Gulbenkian Foundation, had really invested much effort into this book. I think I have never seen any of the books in which I collaborated edited with so much care, with correcting mistakes and with producing all these genealogical charts that are part of the volume. But very briefly after this book was published, the Gulbenkian Foundation ceased to publish books in this French editorial. So they did not even distribute those books anymore, but gave them to a certain number of friends and allies of the institute, so that it was even a few years later, it was impossible to obtain the book on the market. So I think the best way would be to have it digitized and have it published online somewhere.
Okay. Well, maybe we can do that, David.
Maybe so. Dr. Alexander Beider.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wilke. I would first of all thank you for all the work you have done, because when I was working on my dictionary of Jewish surname used in the Portuguese communities, I read and I studied in detail all the books that you have shown by Révah and that you were prepared thanks to your help. And I would like just also to add one element. You spoke about the discussion, polemics, which was extremely strong between Saraiva and Révah. And Révah was defending the possibility to make a historical study which would be objective against a Marxist approach. And on my side, when I was during the last years working on the dictionary of Jewish surname from the Ottoman Empire, I also studied the history of Judeo-Spanish, and what I found that the work written by Révah and published in 1961, it is again it's the same kind of, there is no polemics, but people, linguists who wrote mainly about Judeo-Spanish, they make no polemics against Révah, they just ignore it. And I found the paper written by Révah, and then I read this paper. For me, it was striking because it was again an example, extremely interesting example of an attempt to study something as an objective science without making any ideological bias. Because for me, linguists from the Max Weinreich school, Jewish-oriented school, they, for me, really have an ideological bias against which is not present at all in the study by Révah. And for me, the 20 pages he wrote, Révah, in which he proposed the only, from my linguistic perspective, the only objective way of the development of Judeo-Spanish that is not as a language which was already totally different from the language spoken by Christians in the Iberian Peninsula already before the exile, but a language that was formed already after the exile and under the factors that were social prestige of Castilian, and not because the Castilian migrants were more numerous than migrants from other parts of Iberia. When I was looking into details which are against historical and objective, for me, Révah is the person who wrote the most exact and the most neutral and objective study of Judeo-Spanish.
Mm-hmm. So these are two different polemics. The
Yeah.
polemic about the Inquisition and the New Christians,
Yeah.
and the many different polemics about Judeo-Spanish. And interestingly, the publication activity of E.S. Révah starts with a polemical article already against Cruz. So it goes all through his activity that there are disagreements and that he does not shy away from polemical standpoints. And I have the impression that there are that there are also different considerations involved. Why he was objected to and why he was countered by colleagues. Whereas from his own side, I would totally agree with you. He tries to keep also his own ideological standpoints in check. He says in this unpublished manuscript that one can deeply hate the Inquisition and reject all those and condemn all those who served it, but still insist that they be treated with impartiality by the historian, and that they are not made worse than they were. So this is something that is very very striking in his attitude to his subjects,